We're sisters, best friends, and authors on a mission to help you stoke your creative fire and live the life of your dreams. We believe that purpose fuels passion and that creativity is your secret weapon for mass construction. There's never been a better time to bless the world with your dream realized. You're listening to The Kate and Abby Show. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Kate and Abby Show. Today we're diving into a really exciting topic all about magic and magic systems. So this is a big topic in the writing world, especially with writing fantasy or anything that involves fantastical elements and magical components. So a lot of writers feel overwhelmed when approaching developing a magic system because there's so many things to think about. And Kate and I have talked a lot about this, both studying our favorite books and movies and kind of figuring out what are those essential components to a winning magic system that really engages us, pulls us in, and makes us remember the story and the world. Just something about it feels unique and special, but also it feels like it's realistic, like it's believable. Even though it's magic, it still feels believable within the realm of the world that it exists in. So how do you make a believable, engaging, fascinating, and unique magic system that your readers will feel fully immersed in? That's the big question that we're answering in this episode, and we're really excited to get into it. Lots of good tips for you guys and story examples to go with them. So stay tuned for that. But first, before we get into it, we have to thank our sponsors, who are you guys. You're the ones who support this podcast and keep it going, and we so appreciate your help. So if you get value out of this show, go to patreon.com/The Kate and Abby Show and help us keep this podcast alive and free of interruptions. Okay, let's get into it.
So I think number one most important thing is establishing what is realistic in your world. So like you were just saying, it's not about comparing your system of magic or your world that you've built to the world you live in and deciding whether or not it feels realistic. It's comparing your world to your own world and deciding what are the laws that make it feel realistic. What's the framework? What are you going to judge one thing up against? You have to have laws. For example, the law of gravity in our everyday life, right? If it's only applied at certain times or in certain places, it would cause you to eventually begin to distrust the concept of gravity. Gravity that only works when it's convenient and stops working when it's inconvenient is no longer a law. It would also make it super tricky to eat a bowl of soup. And after a while, you'd be like, you know what? I'm not like buying this anymore. Like, why is it like when it's needs to be there, it's there, and then when it would be really convenient to have it not be there, it's poof, gone. And that happens a lot. That happens a lot in if you've ever watched a film that has a magic element or read a book with a magic system in it and you found yourself wondering, hey, if that character can do this in all those other scenes, why aren't they just doing that now in order to beat the villain or fill in the blank? And they're not doing that because the writer was like, we really need that to not be there now.
Right, exactly. And I love that way of saying it, that there are laws. Just like how you have laws of physics in the real world, you have to shape your magic system around laws for this fantasy world.
Exactly. Right.
There has to be non-negotiable realities to the magic.
Exactly. And the best way to establish rules is to find boundaries. So like, for example, Superman and Kryptonite is like a really, really easy, simple one. And it doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, the simpler it can be, the better it is, because when we start to get too complicated, that's when we can start to paint ourselves into a corner, which we're going to talk about later too. But so we can choose something really basic and really fundamental and have that be the benchmark that we're going to judge stuff up against.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And something that I think a lot of writers don't consider when going into the magic system, because when you think of magic, when most people think of magic, they think like anything's possible kind of thing. You know, there doesn't have to be any boundaries because it's magic. It's magical. It doesn't have to have like boundaries and limitations, but it does, because otherwise anything is possible. And if
Right.
anything's possible, then certain things are never impossible. And you need certain things to be impossible.
Otherwise,
in order for
there's no limitation for the
Yeah.
character whatsoever. And when there's no limitation, the stakes go through the floor. The stakes are not raised. There's no suspense. There's nothing
no
to
consequences.
really... Yes, no consequences. So, like, for example, Abby and I have talked about this recently. Spoiler alert. But in the Black Widow movie, it's been established in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that Black Widow does not have superpowers per se, but yet she can fall off of a skyscraper smashing into things on the entire journey down and be okay. She can fall off basically a space station that's in the actual sky and make it to the ground without a scratch, looking like she walked out of a salon. But yet later in another movie, she's going to die by falling off of something. So that's a good example of inconsistent magic. Even though you're like, that's not magic, it's still a fantastical element, very obviously, because this would not happen to an actual human being.
Right.
So if we're going to establish that, okay, this character...
She's a person.
Yes.
She is a human being and she doesn't have superpowers that can stop her from getting hurt, then she has to get hurt like a human being.
Exactly.
Consistently.
So either she has a superpower that is, I can fall off anything and live, or she doesn't. You have to be specific. You have to pick one. It can't be, well, it would be really convenient to have her in this scene fall off of like a space station and sort of like there's tons of debris in the air, but nothing hits her. And she makes it all the way to ground, all the way back to Earth, landing like a moth on a raindrop. And she's chill. She's good. She's good
Without
to go to
a
the next thing.
parachute.
Yeah. And yet later it's like, oh, we need her to die. Let's see. How about we make her fall off of something? Well, we just established through her standalone film that doesn't seem to really do a whole lot. But it would be convenient to have it happen now.
Right. So yeah, that's something that's very glaring. That like up until that moment, it was pretty much established that like she's a human being, she has human limitations, but then suddenly she doesn't. So that kind of throws your audience for a loop when it's like, well, wait a minute. You just promised me one thing and now you kind of broke your promise. That's really what it feels like with a magic system that doesn't follow any specific set of rules. It's just kind of conveniently does what it needs to do, what the writer needs it to do at the moment. That kind of, what it does is it starts to deteriorate the trust that you have between you as the writer and the reader or the audience. You know, there's this level of trust where we can believe what you're telling us. But then at a certain point, if you start to kind of lose that trust through inconsistency, it really makes you not believe in it as much. You know?
Exactly.
It pulls you out of the story, I should say.
Yeah, a promise is a
mean.
good way to put it because
makes
you're
you-
setting up something for the future. That's really what a lot of setting up the magic system is. You're setting up what is the conflict going to be in the future.
It's kind of like with historical inaccuracies, how like historical inaccuracies in historical fiction can kind of pull you out of the story and make you think, oh, that's not accurate. And now suddenly you're not immersed in the story anymore.
Right.
To me, it's the same way with magic systems that are inconsistent.
Exactly. Yeah, because you're like you said, you want your reader to be submersed the whole time and not like, wait a minute, how does that work? And now we're looking at technical elements. And so going back to the Superman kryptonite thing, that's just a really good basic example of like, okay, we've established that Superman can do like all these great things unless kryptonite is present, which weakens him. And then he's in trouble and then he can't do those things. Now, if we see that looming in the distance, we're like, ooh, now suspense is being built. We are waiting for that moment for conflict to happen because we've established that will be the weakness. So establish what the weaknesses are, what the boundaries are, what is the kryptonite to the magic or to the magical character.
Yes,
It's important.
for sure.
That's what builds the suspense.
Yes.
So ask yourself, where does the magic begin and end? What can stop it? What are its enemies? And a great example of this, I think, would be a really, really simple, this is like very classic, would be in the story and I'm pulling more from the Disney original Beauty and the Beast film, which that you have simple, clear, concise magic established at the very beginning, which is, okay, the curse on the beast will last until either the last petal falls off the rose and the spell is permanent, or it will break when someone falls in love with him. And in this case, we're using the beast's own personal internal conflict as the enemy of the magic, the thing that can prevent the spell from breaking. And the rose is the ticking clock, adding suspense and creating a clear boundary or time frame in which this needs to happen. So there you go. That's really, really simple. It doesn't have to be that complex. It can be, okay, here's the time frame. Here's the ticking clock that's creating suspense. And here's, okay, it's a spell. It has to be broken within this amount of time or it stays forever. And now we that really the entire story revolves around that very simple, like 3-step magic setup.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's a setup for the whole rest of the story.
Yeah, very true. And I think that a lot of writers tend to overcomplicate in the pursuit of being unique and special, but you don't have to do that. Like, you can keep it very simple and still have your magic be unique and special and different. And the thing is, like, you want to take the thinking element out of it. You know, you don't want your readers to be like taking a lot of time to have to puzzle through how this magic works and understand all of the complicated nuances of it. You would be better off spending that time building your characters and your character's internal conflict and showing us why what's happening matters to the characters, why the magic matters to the characters, rather than spending a ton of time building up the different nuances and complexities of the actual magic.
Right.
That's something that I think a lot of writers, they get excited about the magic and then they get stuck on it. It's sort of like with world building.
It's kind of, yeah. It's definitely like world building. But I think that there's almost this temptation where you can get stuck on how clever it is. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're building it and you're getting super into it and you're like getting really absorbed and just how clever and interesting this is. And it's fine. You can totally savor that as the author, but you have to make sure that you're not putting so much complication into this process that later on you're going to be like, oh, wait, I probably shouldn't have made it this complicated.
Yeah, not only will it be more difficult for you as the writer to keep track of everything, but it will also be difficult for the reader to understand what is going on. You know?
Oh, yeah.
Like, when I go into a book, especially something that's sci-fi or fantasy or has magical elements in it that are kind of complicated, I have to like quickly understand how everything works, because if it takes too long for me to understand it, I'm lost.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You want to keep it simple because the magic isn't the central point of the story.
Right.
It's an element that is affecting the characters, but the characters have to be the most important part. It has to be magic happening to the characters. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It has to be about how it's affecting the characters.
Yeah, they're the center of the solar system.
Not like the magic is the center of the solar system and there's a few characters floating around out there, but really, like, just look how clever this magic is.
They all revolve around the magic.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. And so it's best to keep it simple and clear and keep it character driven. Yes. How is the magic affecting the characters? Not how are the characters rotating around the magic.
Yes, exactly.
You know what I mean? It has to be character driven. Another great example would be my book, The Blood Race.
Yes.
In which there's a lot of magic in my whole series, and there's an element of characters being able to transport themselves like with thought alone. There's also characters that can heal themselves. Those are both elements. And I had to establish that this came from experience and it takes a certain amount of energy for characters to be able to do this. So therefore, there are certain characters that can do it, that are like more experienced, higher level characters that have like progressed more through this training system. And they can do more things than other characters that are more newbie level or lower energy. If they get injured, they don't have as much energy, therefore they can't do certain things. So that's another way to do it. If you're like, well, I want to have a little more complexity here, it can be different per character. So in the case of the Blood Race, it's a system in which it's kind of more of a training system where you have, white belts and black belts and metaphorically, it's not actually about karate, but so that you have some characters can do things that others can't.
Right. Yeah. And also I love how in that book and in your whole series, really, you incorporated it into the internal conflict. So like a main point of Icarus's internal conflict in the first book is that he can't heal himself. And like, no matter how much he tries, he can't do it, even as he excels in other areas. And it's like so tied up with his own struggle for identity and his own journey and his internal conflict, really, that it becomes a very important turning point for him when he finally reaches that level and is able to heal himself. And also his relationship with Hawk is kind of wrapped up in this struggle as she trains him and tries to teach him different levels of tapping into his potential as a slider. So there's like a lot of different nuances to the internal conflict and the relationships and like other things that are happening that include the magic but don't revolve around the magic, So right. I think you did an excellent job of that with every magical component of the story. And there's enough breathing room to kind of let some characters be different than others, like you were saying.
Right, exactly. So there can be a lot of variation, but there has to be a reason for the variation.
Yes.
So that's what makes it feel realistic, is when it's like, okay, there's going to be variation here, but we're going to have a very clear reason why. Whether it's, okay, some of these characters are more seasoned in this training system that we've already established, and therefore they have more increased abilities than others. Well, that makes sense. But it can't be, they're all the same, but their magic will work sometimes and not other times. When it's inconvenient, it won't work.
Right, exactly.
So there just has to be a reason for the variation and figure out what that reason would be. So if you're like, okay, I want there to be a magic system. I want my characters to have that different variation. And then ask yourself why and what's going to be the reason behind that.
Yes. That's a great question to ask yourself. And really, like we keep stressing, it doesn't have to be complicated. Like I've seen posts on Pinterest and different places that's like questions to ask yourself about your magic system, and there's like a ton of questions. And a lot of times I'm like, well, really, you don't need to know everything here. You don't need to know the answer to all of these questions, and the reader certainly doesn't need to know the answer to all of those questions. So try to narrow down, like the questions we're providing are really good and necessary to ask yourself, but try to kind of weed out the ones that don't matter as much or won't be relevant to your story, because what you'll find is like sort of like the rabbit hole of researching something, that you start to just like get really giddy as you research and research, and then you want to include all these fun new scientific facts in your book. Well, they don't matter. So try to weed out the ones that don't matter and stick to the ones that do, that are essential for your story.
Right. And like, it's great to make lots of notes and know that stuff yourself.
Yes.
But you don't need to, the reader really doesn't need to know a lot. And the more I write, the less I write. Yeah. Like legitimate. The more I write, the less I write, because as a reader, you don't want to be overwhelmed with so much stuff to remember, that it's actually now a labor to remember everything that's been established to even be able to understand the story. If you have to remember all these things in order to even understand what's going to happen, it makes it less of a fun experience, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. There is definitely a level where you can explore yourself as an author, and that can be a cool journey to do that as you're writing.
Right.
Yeah, and an example of this that is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, that's done badly with no limitations and no real explanation for how the magic works, is in the live action film Mulan that Disney did in, I think, 2020, I'm pretty sure. And there were so many problems with this film, honestly, but we won't go into all of that. We're just going to talk about the magic systems, particularly pertaining to the villain character, who is, I don't even know like what her name is in the story, but she's kind of referred to as like she's
kind of like the witch character.
The witch character, and she can shapeshift into things. So she can shapeshift into a bird, she can shapeshift into a flock of birds, she can shapeshift into other people, and she can basically like take on the form of anything, any person. Like there's no limitations that are set up at the beginning. It's kind of just like she's just like this magical person who can do all of these different things. And so it leads to problems later on.
Right. It's like a really outrageous, she's like frosted so thickly in magic.
Yes.
That is like, she could do anything. She's unstoppable. And it makes it virtually impossible to kill this character.
And it doesn't make sense because of the way they're trying to set up the character, having this internal conflict of like, she wants to take over the country, she wants to destroy the emperor, but she's also kind of doing this in conjunction with the other villain character,
right,
who she has to keep answering to and like working for, even though she has this all-powerful magic. So why doesn't she just take over the country herself?
Right. And we established that she can shapeshift into anyone, like kind of snatching their body and becoming that person.
Yeah.
And it's not even really shown or established how she does this, but she does this. And she decides to use this magic to like take over the body of one of the servants working for the emperor, to go in and plead with the emperor to do what she wants him to do, rather than just like shape-shifting into the emperor and morphing with his body, whatever it is. It's kind of unclear what it is, but it's like, why not just take over the emperor's body and be the emperor and then rule the whole country?
Yeah.
So, and then the character later dies in this very anticlimactic way that it was already established that she could easily avoid being killed this way many, many, many times over. But the director was obviously like, well, we need this character to die now, so that magic is going to come to a screeching halt. So all that to say, that's a good example of the opposite. Well, it's a bad example, but it's a good bad example of the opposite thing. We have too much magic. It's like way too much.
No clear definition of its limits.
No clear definition whatsoever. So when we're talking about like there can be variation. Yes, there can be variation, but we have to understand what are the boundaries of those variations. What are the limitations to those variations?
Right. And that doesn't make your character weaker. It makes them actually stronger because they have to overcome limitations and those boundaries and like problem areas with the magic in order to be a stronger character and be a stronger user of the magic, so to speak.
Right.
So yeah, even if you want this character to be like super powerful, right? And like have all these superpowers, whatever they may be, it doesn't make them weak to have limitations to the superpowers, because all those limitations are just opportunities for them to become stronger. And another good example of this that I think it was done pretty well is in the book series Shadow and Bone, the Grishaverse books. The magic is very well established and well orchestrated in that it's similar to like what we were describing earlier about the Blood Race with the training system, that some characters just have it. They just are Grisha. They have the abilities to like summon water and fire and different elements, but they also have to go through the training system. And while they go through the training system, they become better, they become more skilled and more proficient with their powers. And there are also limitations set up that when a Grisha is using a lot of their power, they end up eventually getting tired and not able to use it, but also regularly using their power kind of makes their power stronger, makes them stronger and healthier. And so there are very clear rules to that magic that I felt whenever I was, as I was reading those books, I was never stopped or pulled out of the story by anything being inconsistent. It was always like, that makes sense. This character does that at this point. That makes sense. I know that they have limitations here. And so it also creates this kind of suspense where you have predictions of how the story might go based on what they're up against. Like we were saying at the very beginning with Superman and kryptonite. You know, if you can make that kryptonite thing for your characters, automatically it raises the stakes and it creates more tension because we're predicting that. We're anticipating when is that going to come into play? When is there going to be some opposition, some kind of force that's pushing against this magic and maybe weakening the character that's using the magic. And so establishing those rules early on is definitely a good idea. And it's something that you can also, I think, ask beta readers about is a really good thing to do because sometimes it's so complicated and there's like, it's complex to create and choreograph the magic in your story, that it's a good thing to ask readers about, whether you have critique partners or beta readers, alpha readers, whatever the case may be, before you get into like the deep editing stage of your book. It's a good idea to ask trusted readers those questions, like how is the magic, does the magic make sense? Basically, is what I'm trying to say. Like, does the magic make sense? Are there any moments where you feel that it's not believable, that it is defying the laws of physics in this world? Are there any moments where you feel something is inconsistent? Are there any moments when you thought the character would use a particular type of magic, but they didn't, and you wondered why? Questions like that. And obviously you can ponder them more specifically depending on your story and what you have going on, because it will be different for every story and every magic system. But asking your beta readers these questions is a good idea because they'll be able to see things that you can't see because they're not as familiar with it.
Right. Catching those things in the writing stage, when you're still in that writing, editing stage, is important. We've been doing this a lot, Abby and I, because the series that we're currently working on has elements of magic and fantasy in it. And so when we read together after each chapter we write, we're constantly trying to poke holes in the concepts of the magic. Like, oh, well, wouldn't he just do XYZ here if he's able to? Or, does it make sense that he's not using this power? So we always have to ask those questions and really push on it to see if it holds up. And that's when you want to do that. Don't be afraid to really push on all the concepts of your magic in the writing and editing stages, because this is when you want to catch it. When you don't want to catch it is when someone's saying it's not believable in the review on Amazon.
Yes.
That's the time that you don't want to catch that.
And it's so helpful, I think, to have each other, like you said, to poke holes in it.
Yes.
Because sometimes you can't. I mean, I know I can't. Like, a lot of times I reach a point where I can't poke holes in it in my own thoughts and
because
ideas.
You're so close to it.
You're so like
absorbed in it all the time.
I'll even say that to you. I'm like, I need you to poke holes in this because I need to know whether or not it is believable and realistic and whether or not it's going to support the story.
Right, because if you're asking yourself as the writer, well, why wouldn't this character just do fill in the blank? Most likely your reader will be asking that later. Right. So it's better for you to ask those questions now, get this straightened out now, get it super strong. And that's what's going to make it feel incredibly believable and intense. And like I said at the beginning, that's what raises the stakes. That's what makes it suspenseful. When that magic is established, now we can count on it later. Yes. We can count on, okay, that scary thing looming in the distance. I know if that aligns with that, this bad thing's going to happen. We want that. That's what builds the suspense and creates conflict.
Yes. 100%. So I think we went over a lot of good points today. Just to recap, first, establish the laws of the magic and treat it as realistically as if it were a world. Just like the real world has laws of physics, your world has to have non-negotiable laws of physics or magic, whatever it is you're dealing with. There has to be non-negotiables. There has to be realities to the way that it works. Secondly, set boundaries for the world and or levels for each character. So what are the limitations to the magic? How do characters progress through different levels of magic? If there are different levels of proficiency or mastery to this thing, how do they go through those levels? What gives them more experience? What gives them more skill? And you can play with the balance of certain characters being better than others at the magic, depending on how much they've trained or practiced. Third, ask yourself, what are some of the enemies and oppositions to the magic? This is also a good place to explore maybe some counter magic, or another system that is kind of working in opposition to the first system. But again, don't be afraid to keep it simple.
Especially good if you have like, okay, the villain has an opposing magic force. Think like the Chronicles of Narnia. That's a good example. And the magic in that's relatively simple, the first book. So you have like, okay, the evil force and the good force, and establish where do they overlap? Where do they override each other? How is one better than the other?
Yeah. And last but not least, err on the side of keeping it simple and specific rather than broad and complicated, because you may just paint yourself into a corner. So don't be afraid to keep your magic system simple, and don't be so caught up in the cleverness and the complexities of it that you paint yourself into a corner, as in you are now very limited as to what you can do with this magic and how these characters can navigate through the world because you've been so complex and specific. So that's the recap. Hopefully you guys took some notes. Hopefully you wrote down those questions that we scattered throughout this episode. Definitely watch it again, take more notes. There's a lot to what we just talked about. So hopefully you guys get a lot of good value out of this episode. Definitely comment below and tell us what you thought. If you're on YouTube, if you're not, you can find the YouTube version of this podcast on Kate's channel, which is youtube.com/KAEmmons. Otherwise, if you're on a different listening platform, give us a nice rating. We always appreciate it. We love you guys so much. Thank you again to our sponsors, you guys who support this podcast. We love you and really appreciate your support. If you get value out of this show, go to patreon.com/The Kate and Abby Show and help us keep this podcast alive and free of interruptions. Until next time,
stay stoked
and rock on.